My sister-in-law swapped my pregnancy medication with dangerous pills because I wouldn't name my baby after her family's grandmother, and she almost killed my unborn child. So I made her regret everything. Hey guys, so I never thought I'd be posting something like this on Reddit, but here we go. I still can't believe this actually happened to me. I'm Jen, 34 female, and this is the story of how my husband's crazy sister, I'll call her Jane, almost killed my unborn baby because of a freaking name. Jane has always been a total control freak. She's the oldest of my husband Dan's, 31 male, siblings, and man, she acts like she's the third parent or something. From the first day I met her, I knew something was off about her. She's got these weird control issues that nobody in the family wants to talk about. Jane was married for like 2 years to some guy named Rob, who finally got fed up with her telling him how to breathe and walked out. That was like 6 years ago, and since then, she's been on this string of failed relationships. Every guy ends up running for the hills after a few weeks of dating her. But instead of thinking, maybe I'm the problem, she just doubled down on controlling her siblings' lives, like that was gonna fill the hole or something. The first time I met Jane was at this restaurant where Dan was introducing me to his family. I was super nervous anyway, 'cause meeting the family is a big deal, right? I really wanted them to like me. Dan had warned me that his sister could be a bit much, but holy crap, was that an understatement. Within like 5 minutes of sitting down, Jane starts interrogating me like I'm a suspect in a murder case. What exactly do you do for work? How much do you make? Do you have student loans? What's your credit score? Do you plan on having kids? How many? When? What's your relationship like with your family? I barely had time to swallow my food between questions. When I told her I was a middle school teacher at the same school where Dan teaches, which is how we met, she literally rolled her eyes. She was like, "Oh, so you both work at that underfunded public school? How do you plan to afford a house on those salaries?" Meanwhile, Dan and I were both perfectly happy with our careers and had already figured out our finances, thank you very much. I tried to just laugh it off and be nice, but Jane spent the entire dinner making these little digs at me. Dan always said he wanted to marry someone who could cook. Do you cook, Jen? Just constant little jabs wrapped up in fake smiles. After dinner, Dan apologized like crazy and explained that Jane had been like this with anyone he dated. Apparently, she scared off his college girlfriend by showing up at her dorm and telling her she wasn't ambitious enough for Dan. Another girl got the "you're not pretty enough for my brother" treatment. Jane basically appointed herself as the gatekeeper to Dan's love life. His parents are actually pretty nice people, but they've spent so many years dealing with Jane's behavior that they've kind of given up. They do this thing where they smile awkwardly and say, "Oh, that's just Jane being Jane," whenever she does something totally inappropriate. They're nice to me but never actually stand up to Jane when she's being a jerk. Dan always stuck up for me, though. He'd tell Jane to back off and mind her own business. He even threatened to stop coming to family events if she couldn't be civil to me. That just made her hate me more because, in her mind, I was turning her brother against her, when really, he was just growing a spine. I tried to be the bigger person for so long. I invited her to my birthday parties, I sent her Christmas cards, I even helped her move apartments once when everyone else was too busy. They probably just didn't want to deal with her bossing them around for 8 hours. Nothing worked. She would accept my help and then turn around and tell Dan that I folded her sweaters wrong or scratched her coffee table or whatever. Honestly, we should have just cut her off completely, but you know how it is with family, you keep giving chances to people who don't deserve them because they're family, and that's just how they are. Dan would say stuff like, "She's still my sister, and she's got issues, but she means well." It's that family guilt thing that keeps toxic people in your life way longer than they should be. After a couple years of dating, Dan proposed, and Jane completely lost her shit. She tried to convince Dan that I had trapped him somehow. She even suggested I might be faking a pregnancy to get him to propose. I wasn't even pregnant. When that didn't work, she tried to take over our wedding planning. She had opinions about everything, the venue, the food, the music, my dress, the invitations. She kept saying stuff like, "As the sister of the groom, I think I should have a say." When we didn't let her plan our wedding, she showed up to the ceremony wearing white. Like, seriously? That's some next level petty right there. During her speech at the reception, which she insisted on giving, even though we didn't ask her to. She told this super embarrassing story about Dan wetting the bed when he was 8, and then ended with, "I just hope Jen is patient with all his little quirks." The whole room was just awkwardly silent. After Dan and I got married 2 years ago, Jane somehow got even more insane. Like, she apparently decided that her new job was marriage quality control inspector or something. She started showing up at our house unannounced, like 3 or 4 times a week, usually right around dinner time. Coincidence? I think not. The first few times, I was still trying to play nice. "Oh, Jane. What a surprise. We were just sitting down to eat, but there's plenty if you'd like to join us." She'd act like she was doing us this huge favor by accepting, then she'd take 2 bites of whatever I made and make this face like she just bit into a lemon. "You guys eat pasta this often? No wonder Dan's put on a few pounds." Just constant little criticisms about everything. After dinner, she'd walk around our house like she was doing a damn health inspection. She'd run her finger across our bookshelves, looking for dust. She'd open our fridge and cabinets without asking and start reorganizing things. Once, she actually brought her own cleaning supplies with her because apparently, our bathroom wasn't up to her standards. One time, I caught her going through our mail. Another time, she was looking in our closet, critiquing how we organized our clothes. She even tried to go through our nightstand once, but that's where I drew the line. I was like, "Jane, that's private." And she acted all offended, like I was being unreasonable. I tried talking to Dan about it, and he agreed it was getting out of hand. He started telling Jane she needed to call before coming over, but she just ignored him or got super dramatic about it. I didn't realize I needed an appointment to see my own brother, or, "Wow, marriage has really changed you. You never used to be so unwelcoming." Then she'd go crying to their parents about how Dan had changed since getting married and how I was turning him against the family. His parents would call Dan all concerned, and he'd have to explain that asking your sister to call before coming over is actually a normal boundary that most adults respect. The worst part was that his parents kind of took her side. They'd say stuff like, "You know how Jane is, she just wants to be involved," or, "She's just looking out for you," or, "She's family, she doesn't need to call first." They'd been dealing with Jane's control issues for so long, they thought her behavior was normal. We started locking our doors and not answering when she'd randomly show up. She'd stand outside knocking for like 20 minutes, sometimes peering in our windows, calling Dan's phone over and over. Then we'd get these long, guilt-trippy texts about how disrespectful we were and how family should always be welcome. One time, she actually used the spare key Dan's parents had for emergencies to let herself in while we were at work. We came home to find her rearranging our kitchen cabinets because apparently, we had them organized all wrong. That was the final straw for Dan. He took the key back from his parents and told them they needed to respect our privacy. His mom, Karen, tried to defend Jane, saying, "She's just trying to help. She's always been the organized one in the family." His dad, Tom, was a bit more understanding but still made excuses like, "That's just how she shows she cares." I remember telling Dan, "Your sister isn't caring. She's controlling. There's a big difference." I think that finally clicked for him. He started setting firmer boundaries with Jane, which, of course, made her hate me even more. In her mind, I was the evil witch who had cast a spell on her precious baby brother. Jane started spreading all these rumors about me to the extended family. Dan's cousins, aunts, and uncles would give me these weird looks at family gatherings. Later, we found out Jane had told them I was isolating Dan from his family and that I was probably cheating on him because I acted secretive. She told Dan's grandma that I was terrible with money and would probably bankrupt him. Dan's younger siblings, Kim, 27 female, and Andy, 25 male, were actually pretty cool with me. They had dealt with Jane's controlling behavior their entire lives and were just glad someone was finally standing up to her. They started coming over to our place to hang out without telling Jane, which drove her absolutely nuts. Jane tried to get them to spy on us for her. She'd ask them questions like, "So, what's their house look like? Is it clean? What did you guys talk about? Did Jen say anything about me?" They'd usually just make stuff up to get her off their backs. The holidays were the absolute worst. Jane appointed herself in charge of all family gatherings, even though nobody asked her to be. She assigned everyone dishes to bring but then criticized whatever you made. "Oh, Jen, you brought store-bought rolls. I guess that's fine then." She'd rearrange everything you brought and take credit for the whole meal. One Thanksgiving, I brought my grandma's famous sweet potato casserole. Jane dumped a bunch of extra brown sugar on top of it without asking me because it needed to be sweeter. I nearly lost it right there, but Dan pulled me aside and was like, "It's not worth it. Let's just get through dinner." That was our strategy for a while, just trying to minimize contact with Jane and get through the required family stuff without major incidents. But things took another turn 3 months ago when Dan and I found out I was pregnant. We were super excited. We'd been trying for about a year. I had started to worry something might be wrong with one of us, but nope, it just took a bit longer than expected. When I saw those 2 lines on the pregnancy test, I literally screamed so loud Dan thought I found a spider or something. We decided to wait until I was past the first trimester to tell anyone, just to be safe. But when it was time, we figured we'd announce it at a family dinner at Dan's parents' place. I was nervous about Jane's reaction, but Dan was like, "Maybe this will help her chill out a bit. She's always talking about wanting to be an aunt." The dinner started out pretty normal. Jane was being her usual, slightly annoying self. Jane was asking me if I'd finally learned how to make a proper roast when she heard Karen was letting me help with dinner. I just smiled and ignored it because I was so excited about our news. After the main course, Dan said we had an announcement to make. As soon as the words, "Jen's pregnant," left his mouth, the table erupted. His parents were crying and hugging us, Kim and Andy were cheering, and Jane, well, Jane actually seemed normal for once. She jumped up and hugged me, like an actual genuine hug, not one of those fake side hugs she usually gives me. She started crying and saying she couldn't wait to be an aunt. For like 5 whole minutes, I thought, wow, maybe a baby really will change things with Jane. Then came dessert, and everything went to hell. Jane suddenly stood up with her wine glass, she'd already had like 3 at this point, and made this announcement like she was the Queen of England or something. "Since this is Mom and Dad's first grandchild, I think we need to talk about names. I've always dreamed of naming my first niece or nephew after Grandma Liz. Their grandmother, Elizabeth, had died a year before I met Dan. She was apparently this amazing woman who held the family together during some tough times." Jane went on and on about family traditions and honoring Grandma Liz's memory. The whole table got super quiet. Dan and I exchanged this "oh crap" look because we had already decided on names. If it was a boy, we were going to name him after Dan's grandpa, Joe. If it was a girl, which we found out later it was, we were naming her May, after my grandmother, who raised me after my parents died in a car accident when I was 12. My grandma May worked 2 jobs to put me through school. After my parents died, she was my rock, my everything. She passed away from breast cancer just last year, and it meant the world to me to honor her by naming my daughter after her. Dan cleared his throat and said, "Actually, Jane, we've already decided on names. If it's a girl, we're naming her May, after Jen's grandmother." The look on Jane's face, I swear, the temperature in the room dropped like 20 degrees. Her fake smile just froze in place and then slowly morphed into this look of pure rage. "May? What kind of name is that? No one in our family is named May." I tried to explain about my grandma, how important she was to me, how she had raised me after my parents died. Jane cut me off mid-sentence. "But this is the first grandchild in our family. It should have a name from our family traditions." Dan's mom tried to smooth things over. "Jane, honey, May sounds like a beautiful name, and it's their baby. They get to decide." That's when Jane completely lost it. She slammed her wine glass down so hard it broke, sending red wine and glass shards across the table. "This is bullshit. She comes into this family and just throws away all our traditions. That's so disrespectful." Then she looked right at me and said something I'll never forget. "Your grandmother wasn't even your real parent, so it doesn't matter as much as honoring our family's actual grandmother." The whole table gasped. I burst into tears. Who says that to someone whose parents died when they were a kid? Dan jumped up and yelled at Jane to apologize immediately. Instead, she grabbed her purse, knocked over her chair, and stormed out, slamming the door so hard a picture fell off the wall. Karen tried to comfort me while Dan and his dad, Tom, argued about Jane's behavior. Tom was like, she didn't mean it that way. And Dan was like, how exactly did she mean it, then? There's no other way to interpret what she said. The rest of the night was super awkward. We left pretty quickly after that. In the car, Dan kept apologizing for his sister, saying he'd never seen her get that bad before. I was still crying, partly from the shock of what she'd said and partly from pregnancy hormones making everything feel 10 times worse. Over the next few weeks, Jane went on this crazy smear campaign against me. She told everyone in the family that I was disrespecting their traditions and trying to erase their family history. She even called my school principal and tried to complain about me. Luckily, he knew me well and didn't take her seriously. Dan's parents were stuck in the middle. They'd call and say stuff like, maybe you could use Elizabeth as a middle name, or, Jane's just very emotional about family traditions. They weren't directly taking her side, but they weren't exactly shutting down her behavior either. Our baby shower was a total disaster because Jane showed up uninvited and spent the whole time making passive-aggressive comments. She brought a gift, a baby blanket with the name Elizabeth embroidered on it, and made this big show of presenting it in front of everyone. My friends were all like, who is this crazy lady? Afterward, things got so tense we basically stopped going to family dinners. We only saw Jane when we absolutely had to. But one day, we had to go to Dan's parents' house for his dad's birthday dinner. I really didn't want to go because I knew Jane would be there, but Dan felt bad missing his dad's birthday, and I didn't want him to go alone. I was about 5 months pregnant at this point and had been taking these special prenatal vitamins my doctor prescribed. They were these big, horse pills that were kind of hard to swallow. But my doctor said they were better than the over-the-counter ones because of some specific nutrients that were good for the baby's development. I had to take them at the same time every day, 7 p.m. on the dot, so I brought them with me to the dinner in my purse. When we got there, I put my purse in the guest bedroom, where we usually left our stuff during family gatherings. Dinner was actually going okay at first. Jane was ignoring me completely, which was honestly a huge improvement over her usual behavior. She kept talking to everyone except me, which was fine by me. I was just trying to get through the evening without any drama. Around 7 p.m., I excused myself to go take my medication. I went to the guest room, grabbed my pill bottle from my purse, and shook out a pill. I remember looking at it and thinking it seemed a little different, maybe a slightly different shade of pink and a bit smaller than usual, but I figured it was just the lighting in the room or my pregnancy brain playing tricks on me. When you take the same pill every day for months, you don't really examine it closely each time, you know? I took the pill with some water and went back to dinner. About an hour later, I started feeling really weird. At first, I thought maybe it was just pregnancy stuff, you get all kinds of random symptoms, but then I got super dizzy, like the room was spinning. I felt nauseous, and my vision started getting all blurry around the edges. Then I felt these sharp cramps in my abdomen, way worse than any normal pregnancy pains. I remember grabbing Dan's arm and whispering, something's wrong. He took one look at me and immediately knew this was serious. My face had apparently gone completely white, and I was sweating. Dan told his parents we needed to go to the hospital and help me up. I could barely walk at that point. Jane was just sitting there, watching with this weird expression on her face. Not concerned like everyone else, more like curious, like she was watching to see what would happen next. The drive to the hospital is mostly a blur. Dan was speeding, and I was in the passenger seat, trying not to throw up or pass out. The cramps were getting worse, and I was terrified I was losing the baby. When we got to the ER, they took me back immediately. The doctors asked me a bunch of questions, what I had eaten, if I had fallen, what medications I was taking. When I mentioned my prenatal vitamins, they asked to see them. Dan said they were at his parents' house but described them in detail. The doctor looked concerned and ordered some blood tests. While we were waiting for the results, Dan called his parents to tell them what was happening. His mom, Karen, immediately went to the guest room to get my pill bottle and bring it to the hospital. That's when things got even crazier. Karen called back about 15 minutes later, totally freaking out. She'd found my actual prenatal vitamins hidden behind some books on the bookshelf in the guest room. The pill bottle in my purse had been switched with something else. The doctors ran tests and found something in my system at a dangerously high level, something that could seriously mess with a pregnancy. The doctor told me straight up that if we hadn't come to the hospital when we did, I could have lost the baby. While I was being treated, Dan's dad searched the house and found an empty prescription bottle in Jane's purse, which she'd left behind when she quietly slipped away after I got sick. The bottle had contained the exact same medication that was now in my system. When Dan's dad called Jane to confront her, she didn't even deny it. She actually said, maybe now she'll understand the importance of family traditions. Like, what? The actual fuck. She tried to make my baby die because of a name. Dan called the police right away. I spent the night in the hospital being monitored and getting treatment to counteract the medication. The whole time, I was terrified I was going to lose my baby. The doctors kept checking the heartbeat, and every time I heard that little thump, I would burst into tears of relief. Dan was beside himself with guilt and anger. He kept saying he should have protected me better, that he never thought his sister would go this far. His parents showed up at the hospital around midnight, both of them crying and apologizing over and over. They finally realized just how dangerous Jane's controlling behavior had become. The police came to the hospital to take my statement. They took the pill bottle as evidence and said they'd be arresting Jane. I couldn't believe this was actually happening. It felt like some crazy TV movie plot, not real life. But it was real. Jane tried to claim it was just a prank gone wrong, and that she only wanted to scare me into changing my mind about the name. But nobody believed that BS for a second. She had deliberately switched my medication with something she knew could harm my baby. There's no prank explanation for that. I spent 2 more days in the hospital being monitored. Thankfully, the baby was okay. The doctor said I'd need extra monitoring for the rest of my pregnancy just to be safe, but there didn't seem to be any permanent damage from the incident. When we finally got home, I broke down completely. The idea that someone hated me so much they would try to hurt my unborn child, I just couldn't process it. Every time I thought about it, I felt sick all over again. In the 2 weeks after the incident, the police investigation uncovered even more disturbing stuff about Jane that none of us knew. The whole family was in shock as each new piece of information came to light. The hospital ran detailed tests on the pills Jane had switched mine with. They weren't just random pills she had lying around. They were high-dose blood pressure medication, specifically known to cause complications in pregnancy. The doctor explained that these particular pills cause rapid drops in blood pressure, which can lead to placental problems and potentially cause a miscarriage. The police took this super seriously. They got a warrant to search Jane's apartment, and what they found was like something out of a crime show. She had a whole drawer full of different medications, many without prescription labels. There were notebook pages where she'd written down the effects of different drugs, with special notes about which ones were dangerous for pregnant women. But that wasn't even the craziest part. The cops got a warrant for Jane's computer and phone records, and what they found was straight up terrifying. In the weeks before this happened, she had been all over Google, searching stuff like what meds can cause miscarriages, how to swap pills without anyone noticing, and even how to mess with someone's meds without getting caught. She was deep in these shady online forums where people actually talked about how to do this kind of stuff. She even saved pictures of prenatal vitamins so she could find pills that looked the same. This wasn't some heat-of-the-moment thing. She had been planning it for weeks, ever since that dinner where we announced the baby's name. Turns out, Jane had a history of shady behavior that no one in the family knew about. A few years ago, she worked as an admin at a local medical clinic, and while she was there, a bunch of people complained about getting the wrong meds, some even got completely different prescriptions than what they were supposed to. But nothing ever got pinned on her. The clinic looked into it, but they couldn't prove anything. And right in the middle of their investigation, Jane suddenly quit, saying she had to take care of her sick mom. Except, yeah. That was a total lie. Karen wasn't sick at all. The clinic had documented all these incidents, but since they couldn't prove anything, they just let her resign and move on. Now, with this new evidence, the police were reopening those cases to see if Jane was behind them too. When the police confronted Jane with all this evidence, she finally broke down and confessed. Her explanation was chilling. She said she couldn't stand the thought of her family's first grandchild being named after some outsider's grandmother, rather than her own. She actually tried to justify her actions by saying she was protecting her family's legacy and that I needed to be taught a lesson about respecting family traditions. Even more disturbing, she showed absolutely no remorse. According to the police, when they asked if she understood that she could have killed the baby, she just shrugged and said, "I wasn't trying to kill it, just scared Jen enough to reconsider the name." Like, my baby was just some pawn in her sick game. Dan was completely devastated by all this. Finding out that his sister was capable of such calculated cruelty really messed him up. He kept saying he should have seen the signs earlier, should have protected me better. I told him over and over that none of this was his fault. No normal person would ever predict their sister would do something like this. His parents were in even worse shape. They were completely broken, especially Karen. She kept apologizing to us, saying she should have gotten Jane help years ago when she first started showing controlling tendencies. And then she revealed some really disturbing things about Jane's childhood that she'd never told anyone before. Apparently, Jane had always had serious issues with control, even as a kid. When the siblings were younger, she would often destroy her brothers' and sisters' toys or clothes if they didn't do exactly what she wanted. Once, she even killed Dan's pet hamster because he refused to let her borrow his bike. Karen admitted that they always brushed off these incidents, making excuses like, "She's just being protective," or "She'll grow out of it." They never got her any professional help because they were worried about what people would say. Now, they were consumed with guilt, feeling responsible for not addressing these issues when Jane was younger. Dan's younger sister, Kim, finally opened up about her own experiences with Jane. She told us that when she was in high school, she'd gotten really sick after drinking a smoothie Jane made for her. At the time, everyone thought it was just food poisoning, but Kim had always suspected Jane had put something in the drink, because earlier that day, they'd had a huge fight about Kim's boyfriend, who Jane didn't approve of. Kim said she'd been too scared to say anything at the time because Jane had such a hold over the family. Hearing about what Jane did to me gave Kim the courage to finally speak up about her own experience. Now, the district attorney is taking the case very seriously. They're pressing multiple charges against Jane, including attempted assault on a pregnant woman and tampering with prescription medication. Jane's lawyer tried to make a deal by claiming temporary insanity due to emotional distress over family issues. But the evidence of premeditation was just too strong. The DA's office said her systematic research and planning showed clear intent to cause harm. We were granted a restraining order against Jane. She wasn't allowed to come within 500 feet of us or contact us in any way. The police advised us to install security cameras around our house just in case she tried anything else. After being released on bail, they were concerned she might try to retaliate now that she'd been exposed. As for me and the baby, we were doing better physically. The doctors were monitoring us very closely with weekly ultrasounds, but they said there didn't seem to be any lasting damage from the incident. The whole experience was incredibly traumatic, though. I became paranoid about my medication, triple-checking everything before I took it. Dan started keeping all my medications in a lockbox that only we had the key to. The whole family was falling apart. Dan's parents started therapy to deal with their guilt. Dan was having trouble sleeping. Dan was constantly checking our security system, getting up in the middle of the night to make sure all the doors and windows were locked. Kim and Andy were processing their own childhood traumas with Jane, things they had suppressed for years. But through all of this, we still had a baby on the way. We were trying to stay positive and focus on preparing for our daughter, but it was hard with this dark cloud hanging over everything. Jane's trial finally happened about a month after the incident, and it was even more draining than we expected. I was 6 months pregnant by then, and my doctor was concerned about my stress levels, but I needed to be there to testify. Walking into that courtroom and seeing Jane sitting there with her lawyer was one of the hardest things I've ever done. She looked so normal, like anyone's slightly uptight older sister, sitting there in her neat blazer with her hair pulled back in a tidy bun. It was hard to believe this was the same person who had methodically planned to harm my baby. Jane's lawyer pulled out all the stops. He brought in co-workers and friends to talk about how sweet and thoughtful she was, always remembering birthdays, running charity drives, just the nicest person ever. Then he played the poor, rejected woman angle, saying her divorce, failed relationships, and feeling left out of the baby naming tradition had pushed her into a momentary lapse in judgment. I almost laughed. A momentary lapse? That involved weeks of planning, The prosecutor shut that down fast. She laid out Jane's search history, proving that she started looking up ways to cause miscarriages the same night we announced the baby's name. Then came the texts. The prosecutor read them aloud. Had to teach Jen a lesson. Switched her precious prenatal vitamins with something that gave her a little scare. Might even lose the baby. Then they can start over with a proper name. My stomach turned. She wanted me to lose the baby. And she thought it was funny. Jane's lawyer tried to spin it as emotional distress from never having a family of her own. But after hearing those messages, the jury was done with her. The judge announced the sentence, 5 years in prison with mandatory psychiatric counseling. Jane lost it. She started screaming that this was all my fault, that I had turned her family against her, that I had ruined her life. It took 2 court officers to drag her out of the courtroom. Dan just sat there next to me, holding my hand so tight it almost hurt, tears streaming down his face. Outside the courthouse, reporters were everywhere, wanting statements, but we just pushed past them to our car. I was 6 months pregnant at that point and felt like I was going to pass out from the stress and heat. Dan's parents wanted to talk to us, but Dan just said, "Not now," and drove us home. That night, we just sat on our couch in silence for hours. Like, what do you even say after something like that? Your sister just got sentenced to prison for trying to kill your unborn baby. There's no Hallmark card for that situation, you know. Dan finally broke down around midnight, sobbing in a way I'd never seen before. He kept saying he felt like he'd lost his sister twice, first to her obsession with control, and now to prison. I didn't know how to comfort him. I was still processing my own feelings about everything. The next few weeks were a total blur. Dan's parents called almost every day, but conversations were awkward and strained. They were trying to process their own guilt about Jane. Karen would call crying, apologizing over and over for not seeing the signs earlier, for not protecting us better. Dan's dad, Tom, had to take medical leave from work because the stress was giving him these crazy chest pains. His doctor was worried he might have a heart attack if he didn't take time off to recover. The whole family was just falling apart. Kim moved back in with her parents temporarily to help out since Tom wasn't doing well and Karen was barely functioning. She'd call Dan sometimes to vent about how hard it was being back in that house, with all the memories of growing up with Jane. Then, about 2 weeks after the sentencing, Jane's lawyer contacted us. Jane wanted to appeal the verdict based on new evidence of her mental state. She was claiming she had undiagnosed bipolar disorder and wasn't responsible for her actions. The lawyer asked if we would consider supporting a reduced sentence if she agreed to long-term psychiatric care instead of prison. Dan told the lawyer to go to hell. In nicer legal terms, of course. Then we got a letter from Jane herself. It was this weird mix of apology and justification. She wrote that she never meant to really hurt the baby, and that she was just trying to make a point about family traditions. She said the medication wasn't supposed to be that strong and that she thought it would just make me a little sick so I'd reconsider the name choice. Like, what? How does that make anything better? I wasn't even sure she was actually sorry, or just sorry she got caught. The whole letter had this undertone of, "This is still kind of your fault for not respecting my wishes." We sent it back unopened, with "Return to sender" written across it. Dan and I decided to move up our plans to leave town. Dan had been offered a position as head of the English department at this fancy private school about 2 hours away, but we weren't planning to move until after the baby was born. With everything that happened, though, we wanted a fresh start as soon as possible. Finding a house, packing, and moving while 7 months pregnant was not fun, let me tell you. But it was really good for our mental health to get away from all that. The best part? Jane doesn't know where we live now. The return address on her letters is the only connection she has to us, and that's Dan's parents' address. We made sure our new address isn't listed anywhere public, and we've warned family members not to share it with anyone. As my due date got closer, the anxiety was unreal. Even though the doctor said everything looked fine, I couldn't shake the fear that Jane had done permanent damage. I barely slept, constantly checking locks and pacing the house. When my blood pressure spiked, the doctor scheduled an induction, but I went into labor the night before. After 18 hours, our baby girl, May Elizabeth, was born healthy. The second I held her, I broke down, relief, exhaustion, everything at once. A few weeks later, Jane sent a creepy letter with baby photos clipped from magazines, asking, "Is this what my niece looks like?" Turns out, a distant cousin had been updating her. We cut them off immediately, and Jane's prison mail got flagged. Even with her still lurking in the background, we focused on May. 4 months into our new life, things finally felt normal-ish. Jane still writes. Still asks if we've forgiven her. But forgiveness is owed to those who earn it. And keeping May safe will always come first. Edit. A lot of people are asking why we included Elizabeth as May's middle name after everything Jane did. We wanted to reclaim it. Because Elizabeth was Dan's grandmother's name, too, not just Jane's pick. The name belongs to the family, not just to Jane. We didn't want to let her ruin that connection forever. Plus, May Elizabeth just sounds pretty together. Edit 2. Someone in the comments called me the AH for not being more understanding of mental illness. Let me be super clear. Mental illness might explain behavior, but it doesn't excuse it. Jane knew exactly what she was doing. She researched medications, made detailed plans, and bragged about it afterward. She wasn't having some dissociative episode. She made calculated decisions over weeks that could have killed my baby. I have plenty of compassion for people struggling with mental health issues. But not when they use those issues to justify attempted harm to an unborn child.